Hey, Fuel the Fight listeners, real quick before we jump into this episode, something that we wanted to frame is really what Task Force Delta is right from the get-go. And Task Force Delta was an avant-garde Army think tank designed to explore high-performing organizations. And the question was, what is the difference that makes a difference? What is it that made high-performing organizations different from their contemporaries? And this was very novel, and this was taking the Army that at the time was a very reactive model to a more proactive model and striving to produce truly high-performing units. You're going to love this conversation I had with Colonel John Alexander about Task Force Delta. Enjoy.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nick Behringer, your host. Got a super special guest today, Colonel retired John Alexander. I can't wait to talk to you about this particular topic we're going to talk about in Task Force Delta. Sir, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. Can you start off and tell kind of your Army story? What made you join the military, and if you want to frame it of what was going on at the time, that'd be great.
Well, I entered in '56. Actually left college and said I want to go jump out of airplanes, and did that. I was enlisted. Went to OCS of the E7 at that time. Got commissioned. Had obviously a number of experiences, assignments through from lieutenant through colonel. When I graduated, I was the director of Advanced System Concepts that was then Army Laboratory Command. Have a lot of experience after that, also with the Army Science Board and with JSOW, the Joint Special Operations University, as a senior fellow there. We did a lot of wild and wonderful things.
Yeah, yes, sir, and we'll talk about that, and I'll definitely, again, for everybody listening, have your complete bio in the show notes because it's quite extensive and very impressive. But one of the things you worked on that we had talked a little bit about previously that I wanted for the listeners they could benefit is your Task Force Delta. Can you tell us what was Task Force Delta and why it got stood up?
Well, initially, I guess one of the key factors was when Don Starry was the commander of TRADOC. I might mention this is the late 70s, so we're just coming out of Vietnam. Army was severely broken, and everybody knew. We had what was called literally a hollow army. For example, when I was in the 25th Infantry, we had 2 active brigades. The 3rd Brigade was in the reserve. Within the active brigades, you had ghost battalions and whatnot. And everybody realized that they really had to do something. We had several key people who were interested and supportive. One was Bernie Rogers, who was the head of Forces Command, then Chief of Staff of the Army, and then Sac Ure. These were very innovative. Another one was General Shai Meyer, who had been Des Ops and moved up at this time to the Chief of Staff of the Army. They all recognized that something had to change. I mean, it really had to get better. And Task Force Delta, a very small, initially ad hoc group, grew out of that.
And what was the mission you were given? So they stood up this this force, and what was kind of the mission behind it?
Well, one of the key issues that really wasn't stood up. Initially, it was ad hoc. It had a very small core. At its zenith at Army War College, there were 5 people.
Wow.
A lieutenant colonel, a civilian GS-14, and there was an enlisted man and 2 civilian admin. However, having said that, our org chart is something that is worth discussing, because unlike your typical line block hierarchical chart, this was concentric circles. And where individuals sat on that depended on the amount of time and energy they were putting into it. For instance, on one of the intermediate circles was a Brigadier General Colin Powell. And so it was a very interactive group, and not all military. I mean, one of the big things about Task Force Delta is that they were scanning the civilian sector, looking for various concepts and technologies that were evolving, and we would engage those people who would come and participate. I've said this is one of the most cost-effective things that the Army ever did, because we had literally the best people in the world on various technologies, and they would all spend their money to come. What would happen is about quarterly there would be a meeting, usually at Carlisle, and they would pick a topic so you know what it was going to be, and everybody would come, but they had to pay their own expenses. And for instance, at that time, I was in the DAIG, and I had to convince my boss, who was also innovative and supportive, as Dick Treffery, that they would pay the TDY expenses. But you had the same thing from the civilian sector, who were coming in, paying all their expenses. But what we were doing was so interesting and exciting and cutting edge, it was worth them just for the cross-pollination of concepts.
Yeah, that is so wild. I'm trying to think if that would work today in terms of having these leaders from the civilian sector come in, kind of on their own dime. What can you talk a little bit about some of those programs of interest and what they were that made people so excited to show up to these meetings with without really any having to be held accountable or forced? Most people are forced to go to meetings. These people are coming to meetings of their own accord.
Oh, we all wanted to come. They would pick a topic. You have to remember the time frame. This is 40 years ago, and information technology and where we are is imperative. We had ARPANET and Ethernet, which were in the embryonic. I mean, these weren't even public things yet. And one of the guys actually running the program was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Burns, who happened to be an organizational effectiveness officer for Shai Meyer, Chief of Staff of the Army, who was in a position to influence things, but was able to get us computers. But it's nothing like what you do today. I mentioned we were operating at 600 baud. That's 600 bytes per, not kilobytes or megabytes, but bytes per second. And you would literally watch letters type out. But this was so innovative. One of the things that they were able to do for a first time ever. At that time, if you wanted to staff paper throughout all the major commands around the world, you're talking weeks to months, literally. You had to go snail mail, get out there. But one of Delta's first things is we actually coordinated a paper in 24 hours around the world. I mean, that was mind-boggling at that time. Another one that Mad Max, General Maxwell Thurman, was then Desper. He was later the vice, later TRADOC, and then Sync South during Just Cause. But he, as Desper, he tasked the group, said, I want to give a presentation on everything about cradle to grave in personnel. And that started with from recruitment through retirement, leadership, health issues, et cetera, et cetera. We got together at Carlisle, and from Monday morning to Thursday noon, people went into various groups and contributed what they knew about various aspects of, again, the personnel system, cradle to grave. Called a halt at noon Thursday, got together and wrote, and when Thurman came in the next morning at 10 a.m., we handed him a book. Now, today, that might not sound like a big thing, but you have data sharing, and that did not occur at that time. So, but the point was that all of these people participated. We literally stayed up all night writing a book, and nobody had to. Nobody's assigned or forced you to do it. It was just that it was so interesting that people would donate their time and interest to do these sorts of things. I think the critical issues that are involved is, you had an individual, in this case, Frank Burns. There was Mike Malone before him was a colonel from TRADOC who'd been assigned by SARI to get this started, and Bill Witt. But Frank was in there taking, the ability to go out and scan the future. He had a model called scan, focus, and act. And by scanning, we looked at a broad range of technologies and concepts, very broad. Some of them were obviously outlandish. Then what you do is from that you would focus on, okay, what are you going to actuate, and then actually act on it. So that's how the scanning was what allowed them to go out and into the civilian world and find the leading experts in whatever area we wanted. But the idea that you could write a book in a day and nobody's assigned there that has to stay, and it was, that exciting. Now, one of the advantages, you had mentioned, why would the civilians participate? A lot of it was a cross-pollination. And the advantage to the military in this is we got to meet very high-level people across the board. And if you had a problem on any area, this is outside of the formalized meetings, but you could contact these people and get advice that, in today's world, you'd be paying big bucks to hire them as consultants. Not to say that the Army didn't have consultants, we did at that time. I might mention one of the common factors, though not ubiquitous throughout this, was something we've discussed earlier, the organizational effectiveness school, and how many of us were OEs, had come in graduates of the organizational effectiveness school. And it says we maintain friendships, and these continued, I might mention, well beyond even the termination of Delta and our military career. Many of us are still in touch.
And that's fascinating. So can you talk a little bit about the organizational effectiveness? Because we talked about this program. I found it so fascinating, and why you think that might went away. Like why did it go away? Because it sounds like such a great thing, but I'm kind of like I'm lost in why it went away.
Well, I was under training and doctrine command. It was actually a school and center then placed at Fort Ord. And again, their mission primarily were coming out of, as I said, Vietnam. So the people who were selected to go to the course were all prior combat commanders and interested in technologies and evolving. And they were able to hire and bring in the top people in what civilians call the organizational development world. This was, how do you make organizations better out there? And it turned into quite like, now it also became a threat. And the threat issue is one that permeates throughout all the things in creativity and that is the commanders think, my God, I know what's best for this unit, and if I didn't, I wouldn't be here, etc. The idea was not to be a threat to commander, but to be able to go in. We had OEs assigned at least to division and post level through various headquarters throughout the Army. These are formalized slots, probably about 800 or so of them. And what you had the ability to do, we had the psychological instruments where we could go in and take the temperature of what's going on with the troops across the post and give the commanders an accurate picture. Some of them didn't want to hear that. That's an inherent problem that you have. With many of these things, values are a key issue. And you've got a lot of young, innovative people going out and doing wild and wonderful things. Sometimes that runs afoul of, the big system. So we were willing to push the boundaries, and eventually they just decided they wanted the slots back. This was as the Army was contracting dramatically, and they just decision was made that we will, end the school and center and pull all these slots in, and thus it died. But I think it was a victim of its own success in many ways.
Yeah, and you said a word, sir, that you allowed me to kind of read about and talk about is creativity, and how creativity is I believe you think is so important for the military. What do you see as the biggest hindrance kind of to creativity, and how can the Army be more creative?
Well, creativity is very easy to say and not necessarily as easy to do. And by and large, these big systems across DOD, not just the Army, but are risk averse. And we get into zero defects and that sort of mentality. If you're going to be really creative, you're going to fail sometimes. And lo and behold, you might even have to reinforce failure or acknowledge failure and be willing to accept it. Now, from an officer's position, as you well know, I imagine it's changed some, but not too much. When you get into OE, your OERs, it's how perfect were you? What level of perfectness? And so
Yes,
if you've
sir.
had if you stumbled in times, there were things that were tried that flat didn't work, and that's got to be okay if you want them. I had a wonderful quote that I got. I was literally in Timbuktu. This is as a civilian later, and I ran into a special forces captain who was training with AFSOC there. And his comment was that creativity is directly proportional to the distance from the flagpole. And it was that, you get too close, and the closer you get to the top in general, the more restrictive they become. So you've got to be able to encourage, if you want creativity, be willing to take some lumps and figure out what are your levels of acceptance?
With that being said, what was the biggest kind of failure in Task Force Delta, or project that Task Force Delta oversaw that was the biggest failure? And then what did you learn from that?
No, I wouldn't say Delta did, because Delta didn't have this organizational structure where it was responsible for anything. Again, we're talking the core, 5 people assigned. And I might mention, I was attending the Sloan School of Management at MIT in early 90s, again, after I joined Los Alamos. But I took them the organizational chart from Delta, because these were supposedly advanced OD folks in the world, and said, who did that and when were you thinking like this? But again, you had these very senior people who were willing to cover for it for some period of time.
Yeah, so I mean, let me rephrase that. Was there a project that you worked on that, for whatever reason, was seen as a failure, or there was a failure point, but you still learned something very valuable from it that you could share?
Oh, I think the OE system itself is probably the biggest, where it was very cost effective. Now, there was an attempt later, because with the Army Science Board and had briefings on what was known as the Six Sigma thing. This, again, from the civilian sector, and they tried to bring it in. So it was very cost effective, but was running afoul of, again, this very restrictive, risk averse, big system concept. My personal view, and I've been unbiased here, but it was probably a terrible mistake to do away with the OE system.
So, with that, being able to take risks, the Task Force Delta, you guys were able to take, kind of these projects that were very out there, and not what you would think typically of the military. If you use the example, and I think I'm stating this correctly, right? The whole movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats with George Clooney, that was loosely based on Task Force Delta. We got to talk about it a little bit.
Well,
but right, or am I being correct in attributing that to Task Force Delta?
well, sort of. Now, yeah, there is a book called The Men Who Stare at Goats. And what happened was that John Ronson took this much truth, wrote this much, and then they made the movie. Now, in the book, there's no doubt who we are because he uses our real names. The Act Clooney is sort of based on me, and the one for one was Jeff Bridges and Jimmy Channon. Now, Jim was instrumental in Delta as well. And he's also the creator of the 1st Earth Battalion that became the 1st Army or something in the movie. But Bridges was one for one. I've actually done a paper on my website said, okay, here's what's real and here's what's not. And I would have to mention that this thing about LSD is a not only no, but hell no. We are not going down that road again. But it, was quite a stretch. And no, Bert Stubblebine, who was the real general, and that did not try to run through the wall. That's one of the iconic scenes in that movie. And now, by the way, there was, they say, the little bit of truth. Stubblebine was a friend of mine up until the time he died. Now, he was one of these people who was worried about anaphylactic shock if he had bee stings. Now, as you know, being in the military and being averse to bee stings is not a good physical characteristic. So he was going out to Walter Reed and actually getting shots to improve his resistance. And so what he did as a Gedanken approach was to say, well, if my body and the atoms are mostly space, the needle is mostly space, and if they're intersecting, we should do this and could minimize pain, if you will. So that did not translate, I'm going to run through the wall.
Gotcha. I mean, how does it feel to have George Clooney play you in it? I mean, that had to a little bit of a win. No, not.
No, I actually talked to Greg Heflin, who's his Clooney is the partner, and they knew they were getting a comedy when they made it. So as opposed to what John Ronson, when they made the book, was sort of, this is real. I should mention goats did die. And if you want to go out here, this is an example of how far out it gets. What happened is, if you're familiar with SERI, the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, that was just being created under Nick Rowe. Now, Nick was a former POW. He spent 5 years as a POW. He happened to have been in my area in Vietnam. And every time we would get information about the major Caucasian being in the area, we'd launch an operation, ended up getting him back about that time. But one of the things he had done was saying, gee, could he influence his guards? Not to do big things, but can I get them just to stare a little bit farther, walk distance, give me a little bit of time and that. So he had asked his people, and the SERI was created, Special Forces at Fort Bragg, what can we do? And he'd also heard about something called Dim Mak. That's in the martial arts that's known as the death touch. Here to tell you it's real. I know that's highly controversial, but what they had done is taken goats, had hobbled the goats. They were in front of the cameras, and they were running time-lapse photography, but it was running constantly. They had an individual that I know actually trained with by the name of Guy Savelli, died recently, but had trained martial artists, hits the goat, and they leave it in front of the camera, and a few hours later, it goes, plop, just drops dead just that bad. So fast that when they did the necropsy, they found that the heart had not contracted. The ventricles were still full of blood. Even more interesting to me, I saw the necropsy on it, but there was, if you've seen, many of you have bullet wounds, what that looks like is a pattern of energy going across the body. From across the thoracic region is a line that looks just like a bullet or the energy going through there. However, there was no wound of entrance or wound of exit. So
Wow.
that's getting in the really far out ranges. But, if you want, you had people who were willing to explore these areas. And, that's one way. Maybe you'll have success, maybe you won't, but we're willing to look at the further reaches.
Yeah, just the willingness to explore that, and that's fascinating. Did when you talked about the ability to influence the guards, is that where the neuralistic linguistic programming, am I saying that correctly, kind of came from, or that thought process?
No, not at all. NLP was very influential throughout many of the things we did, and certainly in the OE process as well. But not there. One of the problems, in the movies, the prisoners jump up and whip ass and things like that. If you look at people coming out of the camps, that just doesn't happen. They're usually unable to move and that. So he was just trying to influence them mentally to have the time to do certain things so they weren't watching hide something or that. But NLP would mention that when I was working in the intelligence community, I had Richard Bandler, personal friend still, we're still in contact, John Grinder, who were the originators, and one that's now far better known as Tony Robbins, but under contract to the things that we were doing with using NLP. I might give an example of one of the things that this is, again, the bad old days, Soviet Union, things like that. So in the intel community, we had people who were LTs or legal travelers who could go behind the Iron Curtain and come out. Now, when they came out, it would only be out for a short period of time. They had to be able to account for the time. Conversely, we needed to know if KGB had turned them or something. So you had to have the ability to reestablish what's known as rapport in the system and say, can we trust them? You also do polygraphs and whatnot. But you had to be able to do this very, very quickly because you did not have access to these people for a long period of time. Because when they went back in, they had to be able to account for all of the time they had been in the West. But the techniques from NLP were very useful in that area.
Could you describe a little bit about that? Like, what is it? And then, since this was used for kind of to build rapport with spies, essentially, then why is Tony Robbins then using it in the business world? Can you help bridge that gap for people to understand?
I'll have to let him speak for
Well, yeah.
Bandler, in my view, was the real genius. John Grinder was a very quick start, and Tony Robbins could pick up on things very quickly. I'll give you an example of what we had them hiring on, and this had to do with pistol shooting, something we called Project Delta. And the issue was that we wanted to find out, does this make sense? Are there practical things that you can apply these technologies towards? Now, we had, I was authorized to find the best pistol shooters any place. And as we looked out in the civilian side, I said, why are you looking? The Army Marksmanship Unit is probably the best at pistol shooting. Now, we chose shooting because it's highly quantifiable. Most of these things were used as, trying to make, sick people better. Our problem was different. We had very good people, and it's how do you make good people even better? So quantifiable, it's not do you feel better or something, it's did you hit the target or not? And we had taken the inter-service champion, the Army champion, and their boss and brought them all in, did a procedure on modeling and what's the difference that makes a difference? What is it about them? And they had, each of them had very differing techniques. What we did was basically create a critical path model that says, here are the things that everybody has to do. From that, had a training program. One of the things I'll give Tony credit for was we used a success model. What the Army had done in the past was you put the target out at 25 meters and shoot until you hit it and learn how to do that. We didn't, we moved the target literally directly. You could almost move it with a pistol, you know, and shot it and then move the target back. The point was you could never fail. So it was what we call a success model. And so then we took paired samples. We had people who had never fired, or either never fired or maybe qualified once or something, but did not have any expertise. We split them into two groups. Our group, we took one. They were, again, paired samples, same number of males, females. With military was just getting integrated at the time. And the Army marksmanship unit, and they trained their group. Our problem was that by noon of the second day, everybody had qualified as expert and with a lot less ammunition. And their group, they went through the standard procedure, which took 4.5 days.
Wow. What did that change anything doctrinally, or did they look at that, or the Army look at, you know, kind of that,
The Army
using that technique?
did do some changes with it. I might mention that we also took those 3 experts who were still in competition, and we moved their score maybe 10 points because
Wow.
they said, gee, here's things that we have. By the way, a couple of the key issues. One, we looked at values and what they thought about the value of pistol shooting. The other was physical. We took them, got them off balance. They could get way the hell off balance and still do pretty damn well. But when you did the mental work, we had them say, hum, Mary had a little lamb, went to hell immediately. So we really became focused on the mental aspects of the training. Eventually, yes, they did make some changes. And what happened, and this is true also, I think, in the OE system, it sort of changed. We started bringing in people who didn't have the initial qualifications and maintain the high entrance levels. And it eventually degrades over time and goes back to, well, this is the way we've always done it.
So once that you established kind of, you know, that proof of concept that it works, you know, with the pistol shooters, was it used in any other settings or scenarios that you know of, or?
Well, this was one where serendipity gets caught up with us. Actually, we had next started on, I was working with INSCOM, and as you know, we supply to NSA the listening stations around the world. A good example, because we would take the entrance criteria was, do you have really smart people? You know, high GT scores is what you were looking for. So is this the right person? They would train them in code. Might mention, this is the old days. Again, Morse code is a simple, you know, you had systems to break the code, but what would happen is before the interactions would take place, the communicators would talk back and forth. And so you'd pick up on their chatter and you'd kind of know who's there, what are they talking about, and all, which is very important. The best Soviet guys were super dits would get what we call up to 60 groups per minute. And ours were doing high end kind of 20, 25 somewhere. So our question, what we did is we had access to who were the super dits that were working with ISCOM, but for the NSA listening stations. And one of the things we found is that the criteria was all wrong. The key issue turned out not to be how fast can you type. I should mention here, the reason it was problematic is they would be trained, finish school, get leave, go to their next station, and have lost the skills. So how did you get around that? Turns out there was a critical question to ask. And it was not how fast can you type or can you type or how smart are you? The question was, what kind of stereo equipment do you have? And it turns out that what you really wanted was audiophiles, and it was their ability to listen that was a key issue. And that was not something that was being, taken into account before that.
Wow. So just based on the fact that somebody really loves to listen to things, and we're up on the latest and greatest, kind of headphones to listen to their music or what have you, predicted how well they were able at taking in and breaking code.
Yeah, but the issue was how well did they hear? Those are the ones who were the audiophiles that
they would care.
I've got a friend here in town who you would not believe. He literally lifts the cables off the floor. So where's the cables going and things that are. I left my years in Vietnam, and I'm that close to death now. And that, as you know, was a major problem throughout the military. Now I think you have requirements on hearing protection, and some of that came in. But had done a major study at Army War College of commanders who had come back and found out they couldn't hear, and it was across the board. And wearing hearing protection, well, that's not manly. Turned out really was a good thing to do. Yeah.
Especially when you need people to listen and be able to break code. So wow, that's fascinating. What's another kind of project that Task Force Delta worked on that you got excited about at the time, or you thought was very cutting edge?
Well, I was actually trying to think of these, and I forgot. What would happen is, and a lot of them were not projects per se, they were just get-togethers in group, and it would be what technology, what's emerging. And again, because Frank had this wide net and the scanning and the ability to bring them in and just discuss these things. My guess is where that would go today is in artificial intelligence, for instance, micro everything. Robotics has improved significantly. One that might surprise you is we were on climate change in the 70s and 80s. And this is one where Jimmy Chan, who created First Earth Battalion, had this. We were thinking about that early, how, and this energy and climate, I think, are critical to the Army. We now know that the U.S. military is one of the biggest consumers of energy in the world. And if you know, there's an announcement coming tomorrow, something that my second career was on, but that they've achieved fusion. Well, it's going to be, for the first time ever, where you have more energy out than energy in. But we're looking at, various things, ecology issues and things of that nature. And this is 1980. We ought to have a military unit assigned to planting trees and things of that nature. It was actually proposed. Now, some of them, like I said, that would stress. That's where you stress the big system a little too far.
What other areas, were there any areas that stressed it too far, or that folks just we're like, okay, you're too far out there. Let's reel it back in, or
Yeah. Well, I would mention that Bill Whitley said he used to say what we need is a balance between the bumblebees and butterflies. Meaning, when you had the people in there, who were you inviting? You wanted some that had their feet firmly planted on the ground. By the way, most of the military involved with Delta were our lieutenant colonels and majors. And again, we were coming out of Vietnam, so most of us had combat experience and were able to relate it to that. At the same time, you had the whole New Age issues that were like, and we were exploring many of those sorts of things. One where there was direct overlap. There was in the remote viewing program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it was a classified. I should mention everything in this Task Force Delta was unclassed because, of course, we were bringing in people without clearances or anything. So it was strictly up and up. So we had the remote viewing became known. I wrote an article that appeared in Military Review in 1980 called The New Mental Battlefield, which was the first time the military journal ever addressed things like psychokinesis and remote viewing. But one of the guys who came to our meeting and participated was Stephen Schwartz, who was running a civilian remote viewing for-profit group, and was able to provide information on that. So there was direct overlap. Getting the problems because you could not discuss what was then Grill Flame, and known now, I think most popular was the last name was Stargate program. But we were exploring those sorts of things as well.
so that's that was interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's kind of like, you haven't seen the popular probably Netflix show Stranger Things, have you?
No, my wife follows that one, but
Yeah,
I'm familiar with it.
Familiar with the concept. No, and that was what was kind of fascinating as I was reading up before I interviewed you, is it's based on obviously to the extremes like any show, but you had an American group that was working on remote viewing for the Russians, and you have Russians doing kind of the same thing, and other a little off the wall stuff. Obviously, it's the movies.
I can tell you in about 1992, Bert Subelbein and I had dinner in Washington with the director of theoretical problems of the former Soviet Union. And I say at that meeting, we discussed things that a decade before we would literally have killed for, but finding out exactly what they were doing. But there is a book that was put out. Joe McMonagle's one of the calls. Joe was Remote Viewer 001, one of the best of our guys. But he did one, ESP East and West, I believe is the name, where they did have a former Soviet general come in and talk about what they were doing. But yeah, there were parallel efforts.
Wow. So there is a little truth to that show. No, I mean it's way far out there, but that was the most fascinating thing. And what was the biggest success that you saw with the remote viewing program, or something that really made you believe in it, or
Well, there were many, and what I ran into conflict was that from the scientific standpoint, they say, what's your theoretical basis for this? And really don't have that. But I said, but we had an operational organization. What was one? I guess one of the classics is the one where they had, CIA had a photo of a base, a big building. It was pretty far north, and had asked Joe McMonagle, says, what can you tell? What they did is they gave him the geographic coordinates. That's all, not even the building. And he looked at it and he says, well, um, there's submarines inside, and they're building several, and one of them is really big. And he described it. Oh, by the way, the tubes are forward of the sail, and there's different, and it's double hulled and whatnot. And so we presented that, sent it to our boat builders, who said, nonsense. If you built a submarine that big, if it went to depth, it would crush. And he also said, oh, by the way, at a certain time, there's going to be a ditch, and this is going to be launched. And sure enough, a short time later, the clouds parted and the cameras came on, and there's a big ass, what is now known as a Typhoon class submarine. And sure enough, it was double hulled. The things were forward of the sail. There were a number of other attributes that he described on it. And I think the Brits are building one bigger now, but for the next 40 years, it was the biggest submarine out there, the whole class of the Typhoon class.
Wow. So that was, that was pretty powerful. Can you give a, kind of like the reaction at the time when, this individual describes the submarine, everybody's like, that's malarkey. And then all of a sudden they see it. What was the community kind of response like at the time?
Well, again, the response was, the boat builders denied you could physically possible. And the others were saying, we don't have any hint that suggests there's been a dramatic shift in submarine design, by the Soviet. I also mentioned this, there was a study by the National Academy of Science for the Army after we were doing a number of these things. In fact, I think it was when Thurman was vice, he asked the Academy to take a look at these kinds of things and see what they're doing and what makes sense. And I had them in and I was doing a classified briefing on some of the Soviet stuff. And I was getting questions like, well, what's this and how is this reported and all that? And I said, do you understand how we get this information? Again, this is bad old days. They are not issuing us, reports on how it's doing. We've got intermediaries who are coming out and getting the information. One of Sullivan's major issues in, again, the intel community, and the reason we did some of this issue was, don't just disregard things because you don't know how to do it yourself, or this thing, it can't be done. But look for parallel data. I would mention 1995, when Stargate came to the end, and Bob Gates, who was then director of CIA, came on. He was on Nightline, and it was a big flap, and funding was being cut. And he said, look, we never launched an operation solely based on remote viewing operation. That's absolutely true. But then you never launched an operation based on any single piece of data. So it's one where, it's true, but primarily misleading at the same time.
So it was remote viewing it for certain mission sets was used as a piece of the data to kind of paint the picture of that operation.
What I say, what it's very good for is a steering mechanism. Where do you look? Where should we go get this? And there, for instance, during the Iran crisis, where the embassy had been overtaken, and they accurately mentioned that, there's going to be an individual release. Now, what had happened is one of the guys was very, very ill. The Ayatollahs didn't want him to die on their watch, and so they arranged, but they were actively predicted when and where and how it would take place, and in fact did, and totally unpredictable.
Wow. That's wild. Thank you
Do you
so
remember
much for
General?
that.
I'll give you another one. Remember General Dozier? This was back in the days when the Red Brigade had actually kidnapped. This was in Italy, kidnapped an American general, and of course that's set off. And they looked for him and whatnot. This is one, in my view, that is both a success and yet not useful. Now the remote viewers, again, Joe was the one who put him in Padua, which is where he was recovered. But the pictures that I saw up at Fort Meade were of this tent and whatnot, totally accurate. What you didn't know was the tent was inside the attic of a building, but it was a very accurate depiction of the immediate area in which he had been held, with blaring music, by the way, to disorient him.
Wow. So the remote viewers were able to describe the tent, but for most individuals, they would think, oh, they're in the middle of the jungle or the forest or whatever. But they had actually constructed this tent inside a house that he was being held, if I understand that correctly. So not perfect, but
well, the point is sometimes it works.
Right.
Far from perfect. A good cueing mechanism says, where should we go look? The biggest issue from a technical perspective is when they get in, how do you do this? And the initial concept must be some kind of electromagnetic wave or something like that we don't understand. That stands until you start perturbating time into precognitive and retrocognitive. I'm not sure how far out you want to get here, but
wow,
that really works.
We might have to so describe that, if you will. Can you? Because I'm not even quite sure I understand what you're saying.
I'll give you a specific example. The classic one that was done is this was using what they call an outbound viewer. So they had somebody who was going to Europe, and so they had the remote viewers say, okay, what is this person going to see 24 hours from now? Now, at that point, the target had not been selected. So they hadn't told the person go to a specific place and whatnot. And it turns out that they described quite accurately what the target was selected to go to a specific bridge in what was then Czechoslovakia. And sure enough, I mean, the correlation is really tremendous. That was done by, interestingly, Bob John, who was then the dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton.
Wow. So yeah, let me wrap my head around that. So it's not only just, remote viewing was used to identify the now, it could actually go 24 hours in the future and see if they were to lock in on a participant, like what they're going to see the next day.
And they don't know what the target is yet to go to.
Wow.
So, like I said, the target hadn't even been selected.
So I guess it begs the question: why did this go away? Was it just because nobody could explain the science? Like you can't, go, well, this is because X, Y, and Z. This person has this ability.
There are several key issues. As you know, the thing I sent you, I had the model of for creativity. It said you need the champion, the resources, and the angels. And the angels meaning guys who can fly cover. Now with Delta, that was the generals that I mentioned and whatnot. And for this program, it was in Congress who had, was supporting it. And we also ran into a religious objection. And this is recurring to this very day, but it was, you can do that, but you shouldn't do it. It's the work of the devil. And Chief of Staff of the Army, we got initially a very fundamentalist chief who didn't want it. They moved it to DIA, and then some changes took place there. And so finally, they took the side. What you do if you want to kill a project, you say, well, we're going to study it. maybe that works. We'll study it.
That's fair.
And,
As a scientist, I can appreciate that. But yeah, there you go.
And that's what happened is, and as a matter of fact, there was an error report that did look at this in the 1990s. They were external consultants. And interestingly, I think Gates was still director of CIA at the time, and it was not ready for prime time. They didn't say it doesn't work. They were just saying not ready for operational capability, although we'd been using it as such for some period of time. Again, primarily as a queuing mechanism, was to where do you go look and try to find other corroborative evidence.
Wow. And so you said that that ended officially in the 90s, mid 90s,
95.
early 90s, 95. Okay. So wow, that's and then when was Task Force Delta officially? When did that go away?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Mid 80s, I know Frank retired. And again, what had happened is this is the Angels. The Angels had all moved on. And so you really need, kind of support who are willing. I don't know if you've ever heard of 42nd Boyd. That's the one in the, that's an Air Force story, which is very much the same thing of how John Boyd changed aircraft design from a scientific perspective, but was taken to task by the traditional Air Force who wanted bigger, stronger. I don't know if you remember the F-111 was a heavy fighter plane, didn't last very long, and this transition to the F-16, F-18 and that. But the point was he missed tremendous resistance to the point where he and Spivey, who was the engineer working with him, I think they brought them up on charges for misappropriating the computer time on it, even though it, like I say, totally changed aviation. And I've seen that time after time of what you can't do, and this is the direction things are going. I'll give you another example. It goes back to the remote viewing. I don't know if you remember the multi-track for ours. We had the ICBMs. We were going to put them on trains and move the things around so that if the Soviets, you would never know where
the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Just so for people listening, yep.
Yeah, but it was, I'm forgetting the name, but there was a specific program where these were going to be on trains so you could move them so the launch sites would change. And they just came up and said, do not want to hear about remote viewing because you could reduce the probability of the specific, where a missile might be at the time. We went to hardened sites, as you know, in the whole northern tier. That we're now selling off for survival in the event of Armageddon.
Wow. So this is, sir, again, fascinating. Hopefully, people are getting a lot out of this in terms of, what an Army program can do with 5 individuals. I mean, you've touched on so many different areas, all the way, from the neurolinguistics to the remote viewing to all these different things that it can influence, to the OE program. How could somebody, kind of wrap it up, implement something similar today? Could they get something started, kind of their own Task Force Delta within a unit? And then what would be the appropriate size? Could you do this at a brigade level? Would you do it at a division level? What would you?
No, it's called echelons above corps.
Okay.
And I think what you have to have, well, people would ask me, I was still a lieutenant colonel at the time, so what's your job? I said, well, I'm a freelance colonel. But in fairness, I had the commander general of INSCOM who was protecting and encouraging that sort of thing and working with others. So you find the like-minded people out there. The flip side, of course, is might not be career enhancing. If you're still into the checking box, do this, do that, you got to be the S3 and the commander and certain staff positions and where to go. Yeah, it takes risks, but it can be very exhilarating. In my case, it continued on well after I retired in ways I could never have predicted. And I encourage it. What you do need, though, is, like I say, the what I call the champion, the guy who has the vision. And now, in creativity, there's a big question that comes up: is can creativity be taught, or is this something that's innate? I have not got a good answer for that. I think you can probably improve, but you got these wild and wonderful, but you've got to be able to protect them and fly cover. I imagine that we actually kill off a lot of our highly creative people early on.
Oh yeah, yes, sir. Agreed there. So I mean, because you can't have creativity in a no-fail environment is essentially
Right.
what I would take away from all this. You have to accept failure and almost embrace it if you're gonna be creative.
Yeah, selectively. I mean, you don't do crazy, don't do stupid. Okay.
Yeah.
Got that. But if you got some things that are promising and maybe they don't work this time, okay. But encourage the people who, again, it's the scan, focus, and act model. Going out, being able to scan very widely, and contact the people you want. You'd be surprised how many are out there who really want to help.
Yes, sir. For the folks listening, any particular site or location they can go to find more about your work, or different areas you would recommend the folks listening to explore or read about you?
I'm sorry, is that for me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you just Google my name, John B. Alexander.
Okay.
And my website will pop up, and some of it's there. And don't believe everything you read on the internet. You will find I bear the 666 in some areas.
I gotcha. No, yes, sir. Well, hey, John, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your wisdom. There might be some other topics, that come of this in terms of roads we want to go down, but I really appreciate you sharing your story with the listeners, and I know folks got a lot out of it by hearing this.
And I'm always interested in hearing stories from them as well as what's success, and willing to help and mentor if applicable.
Yes, sir. I can. Your contact information is on your website, so I can put that in the show notes as well. But again, thanks for so much for coming on the show, and everybody listening. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, and then if you have any questions, I can relay them. You can email me at fuelthefightpodcast@gmail.com, and we can get the questions to Colonel Retired Alexander. But again, sir, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was an absolute pleasure.